Okay, hi everyone. We only have just a little bit of time left in this class, so let's get through it together. My face isn't going to be in this video because my webcam is broken, and maybe some of you are happy about that. I did a test run very early when I started doing this, and the person who did the test run with me said, put your face in the video, so that's what I did. But I guess we're going to try it without it and just my voice here. And we're going to look now at the Balkan Wars. What we're going to say about the Balkan Wars is we're going to start in Yugoslavia, because that's kind of generally where the Balkans are, and I'll show you in a slide what the map looks like and where exactly we're talking about. Excuse me. But we're going to start here with communist rule in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is currently not a country. It used to be a country, and we'll get into the specifics as we go along. As a communist country in Eastern Europe, you would think they'd be under complete Soviet control. That wasn't the case, and we'll find out why here in a second. But Yugoslavia eventually breaks up, and we'll determine what they are. It turns into 6 republics and 2 autonomous regions. These areas are Bosnia, Serbia, listed up here, Croatia, Slovenia, did I already say that one? Montenegro, and Macedonia. The autonomous regions are Vojvodina and Kosovo, difficult for me to pronounce. So these are sort of the areas that make up Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is led by, for an awful long time, this guy Josip Tito. You don't pronounce the J in this particular language, in this Slavic language. Well, you don't pronounce it like we do. You pronounce it like a Y, so it's Josip Tito. He rules the area and keeps the region together pretty peacefully for the most part. He does that in large part by submerging ethnic and nationalist tensions as he's sort of the dictator in charge. And there's the profile view of him later in his life, so he's a rather old guy. You can see his dates there. And just to show you where we're talking about, this is, I don't know why that's so, there. Anyway, this is the area that we're talking about, sort of the southeast region of Europe, zoomed in. So here's, France and Germany, and then zoomed in. This is the area that's Yugoslavia. And just in case anybody is really wondering, Dubrovnik, I think they filmed Game of Thrones there in some part, so just in case anybody was wondering. So this is where we're talking about, and I'm going to come back to this map a couple times because it makes explaining things a whole lot easier when you can see the map. We can never have enough maps. So we'll start after that by talking about Slobodan Milosevic. Who is Slobodan Milosevic? He's the one who really gets the nationalist sentiment going in the Yugoslavian region. Kosovo, he goes to Kosovo. Kosovo is 90% Albanian ethnically and 10% Serbian ethnically. That's sort of the genetic makeup of Kosovo through most of the Cold War time frame. Milosevic made a speech in Kosovo about how the Serbs, so the ethnic Serbian people, who only represent 10% of the total population of Kosovo, should be in power there. Milosevic, for his part, was elected president in 1989, probably through fraudulent means, but nobody can prove it because under a dictatorship like this, it's difficult to prove those kinds of things. So he's elected president in 1989, and he goes up to the breakup of Yugoslavia in 1991, and the breakup really begins with the Serbian-Slovenian War of 1991. The idea at the end of the Cold War was that Yugoslavia would stay together with something of a rotating president a president on a rotating basis from each of those republics or autonomous regions. And it was pretty clear from the beginning that Milosevic wasn't about to let that happen. Serbia, when the time came for a Croatian president, rejected the Croatian president, so Croatia and Slovenia ended up declaring their independence from Yugoslavia. Now, Slovenia, for its part, was the most economically developed region in Yugoslavia and the furthest from Serbia geographically. So if we go back to the map here, so here's Slovenia up here, and then Serbia is sort of the dominant power in Yugoslavia. That's geographically they're pretty far apart. And just for anybody who's wondering, here's Kosovo down here. So, and Albania is a neighbor; it's its own country. Excuse me. So 90% ethnically Albanian people live in Kosovo, though, with 10% Serbian, and you can see it's right on the border with each other. So that was kind of the idea, and it never really followed through that they would remain, or that they were going to have this rotating president situation. Milosevic just wasn't about to let that happen. So the Serbian-Slovenian War is actually over pretty quickly, and Slovenia gains independence due to it. Which brings us to Croatia's war for independence. They also declare independence from Serbia, from Yugoslavia, and Milosevic tells Croatian Serbs that they should rise up against the Croats. And there's, I'm going to go through a bunch of different ethnicities here, and I know it's going to be a little confusing, but don't get stuck on the details, just kind of get stuck on the big picture, if you will. So Milosevic tells these Croatian Serbs to rise up against the Croats who are in charge. He also sends in the Yugoslavian army, which is controlled by Serbian officers and Serbs in general. So this war is brief but pretty brutal. And for example, there's an 87-day-long siege at the battle of this place called Vukovar, the Battle of Vukovar, which quite literally destroyed the entire city. And this was the first time in the early 1990s that an entire city had been completely destroyed since World War II in Europe. So what happens next is that the UN steps in to administer a ceasefire in 1992. And that left, when the ceasefire is installed, Serbia had controlled most of the country by that point. So that'll bring us to Bosnia, and let's go back to the map for a second here. There's Slovenia and Croatia, so they're geographically pretty far from Serbia. They're independent by this point. And when we get to Bosnia, help me out here, here's Bosnia. It's actually today Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is the area, so, next sort of in the line, but they are geographically right next to Serbia. So if we'll come back to this slide, Bosnia is super diverse. We're looking at a lot of super diverse regions in the Balkan region in general, but Bosnia, for its part, it's about 17% Croatian Catholic, 31% Serbian Orthodox Christian, and about 43 or 44% Muslim. There are a few other minorities in the territory in Bosnia. There's some Albanians, for example, and some others. But you can see that this is sort of a diverse population center. And I'll just repeat those numbers again. 17% Croatian Catholic, 31% Serbian Orthodox Christian, and about 43 or 44% Muslim population in Bosnia. And so they all form their own ethnically based coalition political parties, and this is something that's sort of different from the United States. We have two major parties, and one of those parties is probably going to be the next, the president or whoever, so that you don't have to form coalitions, though. But in a parliamentary democracy, which is what happens in Yugoslavia, you have to form coalitions to create a majority, and this is really hard to explain over a video. I encourage you to look it up, but you have to form a coalition to gain a majority of the seats of a parliament in order to form a government, and that's where you get your president or your prime minister from in a parliamentary system. So that's where we're talking about when we're talking about these ethnically based coalition political parties that are formed in Bosnia. So non-Serbs in Bosnia end up talking about an independent Bosnia, but Serbs, ethnically Serbian people living in Bosnia, don't talk about that. They want to be still part of this greater Yugoslav entity that was dominated by Serbia. And that'll bring us to this guy, Radovan Karadzic, whose name is difficult for me to pronounce. Karadzic warns that if Bosnia becomes independent, it will mean a Muslim state. So he, along with the Yugoslav army, begins doing what we're going to call ethnic cleansing, and that's sort of what it sounds like. Genocide, for lack of a better term. The Croatians are initially sympathetic to the Muslims, but eventually they sort of are cool with it, just because they also want to get rid of a Muslim majority in the country. The Bosnian Serbs, though, are the people most at fault for what's happening here. Not that all of them were compliant, but most of them were compliant, and it's led by this guy, Karadzic. Eventually, about half the population of Bosnia became refugees. Camps were often segregated by male and female camps, and as you might imagine, in some cases, some of these camps came to be known as rape camps because rape is usually almost never about sex. It's almost always about power. So the Christian Serbs who were in charge at some of these camps would rape the Muslim women there for a power trip more than anything. So, but the takeaway here is that over 50% of the population of Bosnia became refugees during this war for ethnic cleansing or war for independence here. And here is a map, a zoomed-in map of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And what's significant here is that we're getting to the siege of Sarajevo. And if you remember back to the first week we talked about in class, where Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, and that was sort of the spark for World War I. This is that Sarajevo, same place. The Balkans always seem to be a hotly contested region. But anyway, this map shows where these refugee camps were located, and the bigger bubbles indicate more camps in a region. But what's going on here is that Sarajevo has become the site of a rather lengthy siege. It's a 3.5-year siege, and Sarajevo is actually surrounded by hills. The city was built inside of kind of this mountainous area. Bosnian Serbs occupied the hills that surrounded the city, so they were able to shoot down into the city without much pushback. There is one area in Sarajevo, and I meant to come here. There's one area in Sarajevo that the UN controlled, but they don't control much else. They can bring in food a little bit, but there's not really a whole lot that the UN can do at this point. As we found out over the course of this semester, the UN can be kind of useless at times. Downtown Sarajevo becomes known as Sniper Alley. Bosnian Serbs controlled the skyscrapers that were in the city, and for that reason could shoot people sort of at whim from the tops of these skyscrapers. About 10,000 people were killed during the siege of Sarajevo, and this is important because it's the capital. In general, Bosnia is kind of a mess from 1992 to 1995. The United States gets involved a little bit later in this war, but it's mostly airstrikes, and for the first time it happens to everyone, and it's going to happen to you too. But this is the first time that I can talk about a memory from my life when history actually happened during my lifetime, and I'm teaching about it years later because it happened on a Thursday night, and back in the 90s, new episodes of The Simpsons were on Thursday nights. So I remember President Bill Clinton getting on the TV and talking about the airstrikes that were coming into that the United States was launching to help with this the siege of the city. And I was watching The Simpsons with my brother, and we were all pissed off because they had interrupted The Simpsons, and I didn't really understand the significance of it. But here I am some 20 years later talking about it in a classroom setting. So what about the responses from everybody in Europe and the UN? Initially, their idea is to ignore this ethnic cleansing, kind of in the thought, and you got to say this in air quotes, that they're always fighting in the Balkans. That was the idea from Europe and most of the UN. So the UN ends up imposing an arms embargo, which hurts more than anybody the Muslims who were being persecuted. And they suggested a partition of some kind for Bosnia, but that never really comes to fruition, doesn't work out. America's initial response, George H.W. Bush had decided not to get involved. According to the PAL Doctrine, which you remember from the end of the Cold War video that we did, the PAL Doctrine said no because Bosnia just doesn't qualify. There's no clear objective there other than, I guess, stopping a genocide. But when Bill Clinton comes in, he ends up questioning the PAL Doctrine and decides to act maybe to try and keep regional conflicts from spreading into bigger conflicts. Also, he wanted to protect human rights and ensure that democracy was spread in the region. So that's sort of Clinton's corollary to the PAL Doctrine. When Clinton talks about assertive humanitarianism, like he had talked about in Haiti and Somalia, and now he wants to apply that to the Balkan regions. So from 1992 to 1995, Bill Clinton wanted to lift and strike, what he called lift and strike, and that would be lift the arms embargo. He had trouble convincing Europe but argued that the Muslims needed to be armed, the Muslims who were living in Bosnia at the time, and he wanted to strike the Bosnian Serbs by air. He had little success doing that, and that's my Simpson story. That's where that happened. So Clinton wanted also safe havens, no-fly zones, economic sanctions, and war criminal tribunals set up after the conflict was over for the war criminals, people like Radovan, who had committed genocide more than anything. So events, though, that take place do push Clinton towards a more aggressive action. The safe havens turned out to be a joke and were attacked pretty often. So the Serbian Christians were attacking their safe havens way more often than they should have been doing. The UN peacekeepers who were there were being held as hostages, sort of as human shields, shields from airstrikes. Croatians and Muslims in Bosnia ended up uniting. They came to terms in order to work together against the Serbians, the ethnic Serbians who were there. The Croats had more success against the Serbians after this sort of unification. We also get this escalation of atrocities by 1995. This is where an event in Srebrenica comes in, and I'm going to upload a video clip about what happened in Srebrenica here in a minute. But just in general, Srebrenica happens in July. It leads to this massive bombing campaign in August of 1995, which brings the Serbians to the peace table. You can see here, this is U.S.-led NATO airstrikes against Bosnian Serb positions just outside of Sarajevo. So you can see the hills, they're kind of mountainous, surrounding the city of Sarajevo. And this is in August of 1995. And I've uploaded a clip about Srebrenica. It's this massacre that takes place. And I hope you watch that clip when you're done with this one. It's kind of some horrible shit that takes place in Srebrenica. But the success of this bombing campaign led by the U.S. and NATO makes people question whether it should have been done sooner. So there are some questions to be answered in investigations after the conflict is over. But once the Serbians decide to come to the peace table, we get to the Dayton Accords, and this is Dayton, Ohio. This is where they were signed in 1995. Milosevic, you remember from Serbia, Bosnian Serbs and Muslim leaders come to the table, and that ends up leading to this partition. So there is a separation of Bosnia, and it becomes later Bosnia and Herzegovina. Eventually, war crimes tribunals are set up, and they convict people. You remember that guy, that ugly guy, Karadzic, from earlier, who kind of starts this whole thing in Bosnia? He was actually convicted last year of war crimes, so in March of 2016. After the Dayton Accords are signed, Milosevic tries to rehabilitate his image as best he can. He became known as the Butcher of the Balkans, and he really wasn't willing to give up power. He wasn't supposed to be president again after 1997, but he finds some loopholes in their constitution so that he can stay. He ends up rejecting Kosovo's bid for independence and starts an ethnic cleansing campaign in Kosovo in the mid to late 90s. So the late 90s, though, they end up looking an awful lot like the early 90s in the Balkans region. In this case, in Kosovo, Clinton was quicker to act during this Kosovo conflict. This Bill Clinton, by the way, don't get confused with the Clintons. Madeleine Albright, you remember her from last time. She urges Clinton to go a lot quicker into this conflict, so we don't have the same situation as had happened in Bosnia. So Bill Clinton ends up working with NATO to end up launching this bombing campaign, and it comes to be known as the virtual war. And it's called a virtual war because it's fought mostly on the part of the United States from military men behind computers. I guess they look like gaming systems almost. And to an old person looking at it, they would say, oh, this is a virtual war because they're fighting it on video games. But what it was this 11-week-long bombing campaign in late 1999. It was partially successful. It ended up killing a lot of civilians, though, and about 1 million people have to flee as refugees. Milosevic, his response is to ramp up the ethnic cleansing And after this 11-week bombing campaign, Milosevic, though, he agrees to pull out of Kosovo. So the United States' goal, along with NATO, was achieved here, getting Milosevic to get out of there. In 2006, so a little bit, not that many years after that, in 2006, Serbia and Montenegro end up splitting up. Kosovo also declares independence later in the decade, but Serbia still hasn't recognized Kosovo's independence. And just to come back to the map here so we know what we're talking about. So here's Montenegro down here, and here's Kosovo. Currently, the situation is Serbia doesn't recognize Kosovo as an independent nation. Some countries do, some don't. Serbia certainly does not, though. So later, Milosevic and other Serbian leaders end up being charged as war criminals. They're tried for war crimes and are convicted. So here's a cartoon. I found a cartoon that's not, I guess, that funny, but he's saying, "How can you try me for genocide? We never thought these people were human beings to start with." So that's kind of sick humor, if you will. And that's where we'll end the Balkan Wars. It's still kind of a up-in-the-air region today. Kosovo it's the second most recent independent nation in the world. South Sudan took that title over, and both of these countries are still having problems today. So thanks for bearing with me, and I'll see you on the next one.